Charles Lamb. A visitor to London in August 1820 must have remarked an unusual animation in the life of that city. The season was over, but very few people seemed to have gone. The theaters were still running, well after their usual time. Mr. Kean announcing, for 19 August, his last performance in the character of Othello before his positive departure for America. Wherever one went, in London or about, there were soldiers quartered or on guard. It was said, with some excitement, that a gunboat could be seen lying off in the Thames, and there, sure enough, it was, facing Cotton Garden, while a certain great lady passed through the streets to the tribunal of the Lords, escorted by young men on horseback, and cheering crowds of well-dressed persons, whom the courier called a mob. Where in the month of the celebrated trial of Queen Caroline, the fourth act of a royal drama, never, perhaps, in the very best style, which had swept all England into one gigantic chorus, and by something, we must suppose, Corinthian in its proportions, had roused the least worldly of statists, First Gentleman of London, modest-hearted Charles Lamb, to the chivalry of invective rhyme. He who had declined 6 years before to triumph with his countrymen over Napoleon's fall, because the man was great and in the dust, and persisted in liking men who frowned upon Trafalgar, who in earlier days, in the very chaos and thunder of the new-born world, had found Burnet's own times more seasonable than all the friends of the Revolution could write. This generous and homely free-thinker was for once with the majority. There was only one side for him, the side of the weak, and he was a Queen's man always. It will be readily understood that no other topic, at such a time, stood much chance. Even the reported opening of the Regent's Canal, that singular example of British industry and enterprise, and the prophecy punctually fulfilled at daybreak on the 23rd of still another continental revolution, failed to obtain that share of public notice which Portugal and the engineering interests had a right to expect. Only here and there a few idle people, neither of the great vulgar nor the small, lazily glancing at the current pages of the London Magazine, and voting it otherwise a weak number, found time to ask themselves, and in the end to ask each other, the unusual question, who is Elia? It was a short article, or rather essay, of some 4 pages describing in an assumed character, for it was not to be supposed that the man had been a clerk, and yet it seemed not all invented. The life of a great house of business fallen into decay, with commemorations quick and affectionate of its inhabitants, a queer assemblage, odd fishes, a lay monastery, and yet perhaps to another eye they might have been dull enough, now chirruping, most of them, in the shades. The style of the piece was of an older fashion, and yet new, with such felicities of phrase and pretty rhetorical modulations as seemed to smile back upon their maker. A style now brief and plain, now running into little catches, hanging loose, one would say, upon the score, yet somehow masterfully concerted and knocking, it could not be denied, most strangely at the heart. Reader, in thy passage from the bank, where thou hast been receiving thy half-yearly dividends, supposing thou art a lean annuitant like myself, to the flower pot, to secure a place for Dalston or Shacklewell, or some other thy suburban retreat northerly, didst thou never observe a melancholy-looking, handsome brick and stone edifice to the left, where Threadneedle Street abuts upon Bishopsgate? This was once a house of trade. Can it be wondered that the question was asked, or that, at this distance of time, surveying events from our centennial speculum or watchtower, we pronounce this, on the whole, the question of the month? The answer was scarcely more readily to be guessed at from the man himself than from the essay, though he was in London at the time, his yearly holiday over, and living in free commerce with his friends, where in those years he most loved to be, in the general noise and resort of all London, the individual spot I like best in all this great city, among the theatres and the flower sellers of Covent Garden. Anyone in the habit of traversing this region, says Barry Cornwall, by merely extending his walk a few yards into Russell Street, might have noted a small spare man, clothed in black, who went out every morning and returned every afternoon, as regularly as the hands of the clock moved towards certain hours. You could not mistake him. He was somewhat stiff in manner and almost clerical in his dress, which indicated much wear. He had a long, melancholy face with keen, penetrating eyes, and he walked with a short, resolute step citywards. He looked no one in the face for more than a moment, yet contrived to see everything as he went on. No one who ever studied the human features could pass by without recollecting his countenance. It was full of sensibility, and it came upon you like a new thought, which you could not help dwelling upon afterwards. It gave rise to meditation, and did you good. This small, half-clerical man was Charles Lamb. So Elia, in his day hours, looked and moved. He was in the first novelty of the character, a man of 45, with his golden years unexpectedly opening upon him, heavily tried in what are called the sorrows of the world, but with a gift for consolations. His chief friend and lifelong companion, an elder and ailing sister, only less lovable than himself, enduring the drudgery of the desk because bread, as he would say, was dear and publishers the devil. Those fellows hate us. With no great love for the society of what are called good people, but choosing his companions, his intimados, for some individuality of character which they showed. If they liked something, if they took snuff heartily, it was sufficient. In short, a whole man, moving firmly in his orbit, devoted to his sister, his folios, his friends, and his puns, and living upon principles rather practiced than avowed, one of the bravest and happiest lives in England. His enjoyments are so pure and hearty, a young lawyer noted in his diary of this year, that it is an enjoyment to see him enjoy. Why he dressed as he did, in this Quakerish or Methodist habit, we shall perhaps never know. But as he adopted the custom early, it is conjectured that a distaste for change, or what he called uprooting, and a dislike of being mistaken for a poet or one of the professed literati, may have had something to do with it. It has even been suggested that there was a certain modesty and order in the matter, as of one who retains his rank. He was of humble birth, the son of a gentleman's servant, but in a happy and sometimes lonely childhood had learned the power of the emotions to annihilate distance. The solitude of childhood, he is speaking of Blakesware in Hertfordshire, is not so much the mother of thought as it is the feeder of love and silence and admiration. So strange a passion for the place possessed me. I was here as in a lonely temple, snug firesides, the low-built roof, parlors 10 feet by 10, frugal boards, and all the homeliness of home. These were the condition of my birth, the wholesome soil which I was planted in. Yet, without impeachment to their tenderest lessons, I am not sorry to have had glances of something beyond, and to have taken, if but a peep in childhood, at the contrasting accidents of a great fortune. To have the feeling of gentility, it is not necessary to have been born gentle. This passion for places, and more especially for the places where he had dreamed as a boy, continued with him through life, growing stronger even as time lengthened his perspective, and what had been the present entered, without quite passing, the hither and romantic limits of decay. He was fortunate in all his surroundings. The chance which elected that he should be born in the temple, and should spend his school days in Christ's hospital, passing, as it were, from cloister to cloister, must rank with the imaginative solitudes of Blakesware among the ennobling provisions of his life. He grew up grave and gentle, and by the accident of a spacious closet of good old English reading, into which he was tumbled early, formed a taste and judgment which in their maturity, and that came early, acted, his friends would say, with the almost mechanical certainty of instinct. Like his sister, he loved pictures, plays, and books, and talk. Collected in time the shabbiest library of first-rate books to be seen. Learned to smoke and drink his glass, and at about the age of 25, with one reckless gesture, took all London, its crowds, shops, theaters, and sins, to his heart. He needed only friends, and long before he was 30, had amassed as varied and interesting a collection as any man in England. The one great tragedy of his life, of which it is almost cruel to say how much it taught him, touches a subject on which romantic poets, in their higher despairs, have loved to dwell. There was a curse on his family of madness. Not Mary only, but the whole family was tainted. Even of his robustious elder brother, John, or James Elia, Lamb wrote, after his mother's death, that he feared for his mind. He had been himself perhaps the first to go, and in a letter to Coleridge, written soon afterwards, the first we have, displays at 20 the same whimsically dressed but rooted courage with which he was to face the world.